So, thank you so much for your attention and for the panelists and for the moderator. I think that we learn a lot even on our own job, and that's great. So we ask Claire, who is also an agricultural journalist, to make the closing speech. Claire recently completed a PhD at University College Dublin, examining how agriculture is covered by mainstream media compared with specialist farming media, and how those differences affect public understanding of agriculture. So, Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jan, and thank you very much to the ENAJ for inviting me here. I'm really grateful to be here, and I have really enjoyed all the panels and contributions so far, and especially after hearing the two panels as well, I'm just reminded of it's great that there's a forum here to hear different sides on where the blockages are in agricultural journalism and in the communications lines. And it's great to identify them, because excellence in agricultural journalism is going to be vitally important going forward, and particularly in Brussels, because this is the source, you know, where a lot of that key information is going to come from. So anyway, my contribution, the title of the presentation is The Changing Landscape of Media Attention to Agriculture, and this is a critical analysis of print media in Ireland between 1970 and 2019. These are insights from my own PhD, which I just completed about 6 or 7 months ago now. So just a little bit on my own background. So I'm from an agricultural family business in County Westmeath in the middle of Ireland. I went on to study agriculture. I went on to study journalism and English and sociology, and I did training in different media outlets in Ireland, across mainstream media and farming media. I went to Time magazine in London where I trained, and I went to New York. I trained with Thomson Reuters over there. So mostly in the mainstream media space is where I initially started out as a journalist. My academic background, like I said, varies: English, sociology, journalism, agriculture, leading to my PhD, and the media platforms, some of the biggest titles, the biggest mainstream and farming titles in Ireland over 2 decades. And really all of these experiences in my background, moving from mainstream journalism into agricultural journalism, raised all these questions in my mind about, gosh, there seems to be different understandings about agriculture, very clear differences in the farming community and in just with the general consumer and people not from agricultural backgrounds. And I was wondering, you know, where is media playing a role in that? And over time, that really led me towards my PhD, and supervised by Dr. Tomás Russell and Dr. Pádraig Wims at the School of Agriculture in UCD. And my PhD over the 4 years was funded by Research Ireland. So I just want to give you a little bit of background and rationale to why I felt it was important to look at media coverage of agriculture, particularly in Ireland, where I was from, where I knew, where I was comfortable. So to begin, I really looked into the literature to understand, you know, why is it important to look at how the media covers the subject. And there's lots of studies out there that show that media coverage of agriculture affect perception of the sector, affects consumer perception, affects the farmers' perception, affects the policymakers' perception. So there's plenty of studies that back that up with evidence. It also affects the discourse that happens in society and the discourse that's happening in the agricultural communities. So again, there are studies there to show that the coverage of agricultural issues affects how people talk about these issues on the ground. and also media coverage really mobilises, media coverage of agriculture mobilises consumers in terms of maybe the decisions that they make with their, their shopping basket, and it mobilises farmers in terms of their being active on certain issues, which can, lead to protests and or can lead to adoption of different technologies or sustainable practices. So, but while there's there's research, not lots, but there is research out there that shows that coverage of agriculture affects perception, discourse and mobilisation. A lot of that research is very much based on, well, first of all, it's very much US based. So a lot of the research that has taken place has been bedded in the US. A lot of the research is issue and event orientated. So it's coverage of specific issues affecting the sector, be that environmental issues, animal welfare issues, consumer issues, or practice issues, but they're event orientated, the studies. It's not looking at just general coverage of agriculture as a subject. So that's really limited, particularly in Europe. As well, the research that exists on how coverage of agriculture affects society and just the coverage generally, how it has changed, primarily is focused on short to medium time frames. So you're looking at between 1, 5, 10, maybe 15 years, that kind of range. So we don't have really any long-term analysis on how agriculture has changed as a media subject over time, whereas for other subjects, for say politics or business or the environment, there's more studies on those subjects over time, but not so much on agriculture. So really, I saw that we have no real baseline on to understand how coverage of agriculture is being communicated to different audiences over time that we could maybe learn from to predict where is it going to go in the future. So this led to my PhD, Finding Agriculture's Place in the Journalistic Field, a critical analysis of print media in Ireland. And just some context to position the research at the time, and this is still the context for today. These are just some data from the Central Statistics Office outlining how Ireland's rural, urban and farming demographics have shifted between 1960 and 2023. So the red line there is the urban population growth over that period. The green line is the decline in the rural population, and the blue markings underneath is the decline in our farmer population over the same period. At the same time, it's interesting talking to colleagues here, we make comparisons between farming and journalism because there's been such volatility in both sectors over time. This is some data on changes in average circulation of mainstream and farming, some mainstream and farming newspapers in Ireland over time between 2000 and 2019. So you can see, some of the biggest titles: the Sunday Independent, the Irish Independent, the Irish Times, how circulations have gone down. The Farmers' Journal in purple has stayed relatively okay, which is interesting. And the Evening Echo, that evening newspaper, that was a very big style in Ireland for a number of years, that has gone down. But I think what's interesting there is, we've talked a lot today about digital and social media, which absolutely have a role in the media systems, all our media systems. But I think what's important to highlight, now maybe it's my Irish perspective on this, but farming populations, the average age, like around Europe, you're talking mid-50s to, early 60s. And that generation, there's a lot of that generation that are still using traditional media, that are still reading papers and or magazines, that are still reading print. So I think that's really important for agricultural journalists to bear in mind, because it's a little bit unique for that sector. So that print coverage is still quite important. So anyway, the overall aim of my research was to establish this kind of baseline understanding on long-term changes in media coverage of agriculture, and then to consider what could the potential influence be on mainstream audiences and farming audiences. So first, I wanted to assess the status of modern agricultural reporting in Irish print media. So what's the status quo? What's actually going on? Is there issues with it, or should I move on to a different topic? So yeah, kind of a test to see what's the status of the reporting between the different media types. Secondly, then, if I had identified that there is an issue, examine then how print media coverage of the sector has changed over time. So how did we get to the modern stage? You know, this is what's happening now, but how did we get here? And thirdly, then, to analyse the evolution of Irish agricultural reporting in an international context and to identify future directions. So is what has happened or is happening in Ireland unique to Ireland, or could you explain it internationally? Because, as I said, we have very, very little European research in this area, just looking at agriculture as a general media subject. So there were my three areas that I wanted to tackle. My first research question was, what distinctions in the extent of coverage of agriculture can be identified between mainstream newspapers and farming newspapers over that 1970 to 2019 period? That was the period because that was the time when there was a whole lot of change in Irish agriculture. We joined the European Union. The sector really developed in Ireland. We had all those changes in the population, as I've shown, up to 2019. And I stopped in 2019 because COVID happened after that, which actually affected coverage of everything. So I felt that I wasn't going to get a general sense of coverage of agriculture after 2019. So, but I do intend to continue with this study later years. So the second research question then, how has the scope, that's the angles and the characteristics of the coverage changed between both media types over that time frame? And thirdly, how can an external perspective on agricultural journalism deepen our understanding of the evolution of the profession over time? So key results, and I'll just to point out the third research question there, that paper is still in publication, so I'm not going to present the findings from that because I don't have it published yet, so but maybe at a later date, but I'll bring you the findings from the others. So my first research paper, like I said, to really get an idea of the status of ag reporting in Ireland, I looked at, well, what was the biggest issue to affect both, that there was coverage of it in both the farming press and the mainstream press over a substantial period, and that was the beef crisis in Ireland in 2018 and 2019. Beef prices were at a historical low, farmers were under severe pressure, and there was protests that started at a more local and regional level that eventually developed to a national scale protest. So I settled on that as my event, and I was going to do an analysis of the coverage. It was over a 14-month period between the mainstream and farming media, and I was asking, you know, is there a difference in the speed at which the mainstream and farming media covered that, the beef crisis in Ireland, and is there a difference in the extent of the coverage, so the amount of the coverage that was given to that issue by both media types before the crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis. And so what I found was the Farmers' Journal, which would be the largest farming newspaper in the country, that they started reporting on this crisis in the paper edition in November 2018, and then the Irish Times, which is a mainstream publication, highly influential publication, they started covering it almost over 6 months later, in May 2019. So a 6-month gap there in the coverage. At the same time, like you can see with these photographs here, which are all from the farming media and some from the mainstream media in Ireland, there was massive farmer unrest building in our local communities, marts, hotel, conference rooms, you know, community halls, there was meetings going on all over the country. Farmers were seriously under stress and seriously concerned about the outlook for beef prices. But you always saw it was the farming media that were at these events and less presence of the mainstream media. So it wasn't until the crisis really became a national, where they were protesting outside our government buildings and blocking up Dublin city, that's when it became a big issue for the mainstream media. So there was this 6-month gap. So it was only when it really became quite a conflict situation and a highly emotive situation, and the city was affected, that the mainstream media started really covering the issues. But farming newspapers demonstrated that they're much closer, obviously, to the lived realities of farmers, and they provided much earlier, more continuous and more detailed coverage of that crisis over the 14-month period. So that's just my key. So crisis was the word that came to mind for my first paper, crisis coverage. So then, so I said to myself, okay, so there seems to be an issue between how mainstream and farming media are covering agriculture. Why was there a 6-month gap? Like, what is the problem? So then I said I'd go back and look at trends up until that point, basically, to understand, right, well, how did we get here? And this slide just outlines that second paper. This has also been published in the Journal of Agricultural Education and Extension. The title of this paper is The Great Divide, How the Gap Between Mainstream and Farm Media Attention to Agriculture Has Widened, with some lessons from Irish newspapers. So for this study, I analysed 2,805 articles, so over 1,000 in mainstream and 1,800 in the farming press. And the questions I was asking were, how has the frequency of agriculture-related articles changed across the media types since 1970? The frequency, just the sheer number of articles about agriculture that are coming out over that period, how has that changed? How has the prominence changed? So what pages do those stories appear on? What sections do they appear on? And how have the topics, so the general sense of the topics of the articles that are being covered over time, how has that evolved? And these are just some findings from that. So this is the total distribution of the mainstream articles. So of those 1,000 articles that I analysed in the mainstream newspapers, it was 6 newspapers. This is the way the coverage went over time. So in 1970, 80, 1990, quite high coverage of agriculture articles in those years, but then you could see 2000, 2010, the numbers went down and they started to go up again in 2019. Now I need to, I understand there are limitations to my study. I only looked at 2 weeks from each of those years, but I have to draw the line somewhere. And it was the same 2 weeks from each of those years, because I'm trying to get a sense of general coverage, not just when big issues happen, but just general coverage. This is the farming press. So you can see the farming press and the mainstream press had kind of similar amounts of articles in 70, 80, 90s. Farming press is increasing, and then farming press really increased in these periods, while the mainstream frequency in the coverage of article went down. Though I do accept that it went up a little bit in 2019. But it just shows there's a gap there. There's obviously a lot going on in Irish agriculture in that period, but it didn't. It looks to the data suggests that maybe those stories weren't as of interest to the mainstream newspapers. In terms of the placement of the articles, where they appeared in the mainstream media, you can see there was a higher number of splash articles, so front page leads in the 70s and 80s, and the front page leads went down over time. Off leads, so the second most important story on the page, again, more of them in earlier years, less over time. Short stories, and this is interesting, the short stories mostly in the mainstream media in the 70s and 80s, it was actually just prices of food that were reported on a daily basis. Also mart reports were published in the city newspapers, but what were farmers getting for the price of milk, the price of beef, the fruit and veg? They were like regular, that was regular coverage of ag. Page leads, as you can see, went up in 2019. So again, there's more interest coming back to agriculture, it would suggest, in 2019. The distribution of mainstream articles then, so on what pages they appeared in. So again, in those earlier decades, page 1, which is the dark blue, was much more prominent in the 70s and 80s. And then when you come to the later years, less agricultural stories appeared on the front page in my data set. Distribution then of the key topics in mainstream newspapers between 1780 and 2019. So I picked out some of the key topics: economic stories, production, environment, industry, legal, politics and consumer. Again, as you can see, in the 70s and 80s, mainstream media focused more on the economic issues affecting agriculture. That's where a lot of the coverage came from, was focused on those types of stories. Industry stories appeared there a lot. That'd be kind of agribusiness type stories. But by 2019, there's a much bigger variety in the types of stories. And as you can see, a fall off in those more economic and industry based, but where you see an increase is in political stories around agriculture, environmental stories and consumer stories related to ag. Whereas in the farming media, the key topics have remained the same over time: economic, production and industry. So really consistent, traditional kind of conventional type of topics are in the farming press over time. So that suggests just that over time those topics are changing a lot, and that means the audience perception of agriculture is really changing a lot as well. So key results and considerations from my second paper, I suggest that there's been a decline in mainstream media attention to agriculture in Ireland over time, that the farm media as a result have exerted higher agenda-setting power over Irish agriculture because the mainstream media wasn't covering it maybe as much, so the farming media had more say on the sector, so more agenda-setting power with the likes of the policymakers, such as in Europe. So there's this widening gap in agricultural topic priorities as well between the two different media types over time. And this really matters because, as we've talked about so much today, as the personal connection between the public and farming widens, these continued diverse approaches can be problematic for society, for agriculture, and actually for policy development and capacity building and implementation. The third paper looked at specifically at news, agricultural news in mainstream and farming media. So this was over 900 articles for this piece. And I specifically focused on the headlines and the lead of articles because that tends to shape perception a lot. You know, people don't necessarily read the full article. So I just went, and again, you have to draw lines as a researcher as well, but I acknowledge that this is more the early framing of the stories that I was looked at. So this paper is under a second round of review in the Journal of Applied Communications. So the questions I asked: have the early framing patterns in agricultural news evolved? How have they evolved between the media types over time? How have the type of first sources that are used in the stories changed over time? How have the types of reporters that are writing these stories changed? And how has the tone of the headline, just the headline, changed over time between the media types? So the results of the early frame analysis show that in mainstream media, economic consequences framing was a much bigger part of the framing again in the 70s and 80s. So economic consequences, where there is a consequence of an economic decision or an economic consequence on the farm or in a business, that type of thing. Conflict frames were still there as well. But again, as you see, over time, you have in mainstream media by 2019, you have more conflict frames, you have less economic consequences. Responsibility frames are consistent, actually more consistent over the timeline as well. So then in the farming media, again, the opposite is the case, where economic consequences is the main framing that's used, early framing that has used in my data set in the farming media. Conflict is still there as well, but you know, you can see yourselves the orange is really standing out. And then in terms of the first cited source of agricultural news in mainstream media over time. So what you can see here is that national agricultural policymakers, farm associations and lobby organisations, and agribusiness and industry sources, they had a much higher presence in the earlier reporting of agriculture in the mainstream newspapers. But over time, those sources reduced. Not all of them and not all consistently, but there's less. And what you see instead happening is you have a greater increase in general political representatives, so political representatives who are not from the agricultural brief being quoted on agricultural news sources. Government and public administration sources increased over time, and you have civic society and environmental organisations increasing over time as well. So again, big change in the type of first source, and the first source is very important, that's covered in the topics or covered in the articles. Interestingly, well, maybe, you know, as maybe expected, in the farming media, it's the same. It's those traditional, conventional agricultural sources that maintain the top source position in that farming newspaper coverage over time. National agricultural policy makers, farmers associations and lobby, agribusiness and industry, and you have less first sources from the general political representatives, government and public administration, though some of them have increased. Like I said, it's not perfect, it's not a complete decline all the time, it changes, but there's far less civic society and environment. There's none actually in my data set. So again, it shows there's different sources talking to the farmers, different sources talking to the general media. And it might be expected, obviously, that these changes are there, but it's important to actually acknowledge that this is what's happening, and then how is that affecting the different readers. The range of journalists then covering ag over time, again, in mainstream media, there was a lot more agriculture specialist reporters in the mainstream newspapers in Ireland, again, in those earlier decades. In 2010, there is 10 written there, but it was a special series of March reports that featured in one of the evening newspapers. General news then, there's really a lot of the agricultural reporting is done by general news writers in the mainstream media, but also what we've seen over time, greater diversity of environment, industry and political writers writing agricultural stories. By contrast, in the farming media, there is less diversity, less variety in the types of journalists writing the stories. Again, you're sticking with the more traditional types writers, and that's who's writing the pieces over time, and there's less change in that. And then finally, with the headline tone, this was the headline tone towards the agricultural sector in mainstream newspapers across time. So this is positive, negative, neutral to positive and neutral to negative. So you can see strong negative angle in the headline. And then in the farming sector, so you have positive, negative and neutral. So neutral is more prevalent, but negative is still there and positive. So, you know, again, that kind of, people think that farm and media are soft even on agriculture, but that's not always the case, like from my data set. And I'm over. They're the key findings. I've spoken through them there. That the framing has changed from a position of alignment in earlier years to widening, more of a divergence over time. Agricultural news drew on broader range of first cited sources over time. The types of reporters covering agriculture news became more varied in mainstream newspapers relative to farming newspapers, and negative headline tone became more prevalent in mainstream agricultural news than farming news over time. So this is just, that's a summary of the changes basically over the period, you know, crisis coverage, less coverage, more societal angle, broader reporter base in the mainstream coverage, more consistent traditional, narrower coverage in the farming newspapers, economic consequences frames, conflict frames. And just in terms of EU specifics, you know, there's indications. I didn't look specifically at the EU for mine, but what I can pull from my data set, indications of a declining presence of agricultural correspondence reporting for Irish mainstream media from Brussels and Strasbourg, indications of reduced frequency of agricultural reporting in world sections in both media types, indications of less use of international sources in ag news reporting in mainstream, and an increased use of international sources in the farming newspapers. So that's just my key final concept that I'd leave you with. Agriculture as a media subject in the middle is, moving in different directions with between mainstream coverage and farming coverage. And the trends that I detected in my research largely align with experts that I have interviewed from the field, that I will be publishing that work. But further research is needed to really help further explain these patterns so we can predict then future trends. So I'll leave it there at that. Thanks.
I'm personally very impressed, because we all are feeling that there is movement, but you qualified them. It's great. Thank you so much for that. We've got only time for one question, because, one question. Melanie?
Sorry, I'm dying to ask this. As someone who works and has only worked in specialized media, so I've only ever written for agricultural publications. I currently report to over 25 globally, and my readers are always farmers or people who work in agribusiness. I recognize this problem, and that we should maybe be trying to crack the code of writing for mainstream media, because we carry so much knowledge and information and have access. But I have to say that when I've tried, it's not worked. So I've tried to reach out to mainstream publications. I tried to pitch columns or pitch story ideas that I think would be relevant to a wider readership, to the public. And I have to say the answer has always come back, no. No, there's no interest in it. So what do you think we could be doing differently as specialized media to write for a wider audience, to the general public?
Really important question, and it's it's really admirable that you are trying to build that relationship with mainstream outlets. It's obviously it's about building relationships with a media house, and building a relationship, building content that will speak to their audience. So I suppose if you're quite a technical writer, writing then for a general audience, it is a different audience. It's a different type of writing. It's a different angle. And so I would say the best approach might be to actually speak to an editor and ask, well, what interests you about, they understand their audience, what type of agricultural stories are they interested in? What type, like my data set says that they're interested in environmental angles, consumer angles. I know, but that doesn't have to be something particularly daunting. The stories can be written on those topics, that it can be in a very fair way, and so I think that that's I imagine editors want to know that the content will speak to their audience, that it's a general audience, and not that the content will be too technical, that they'll be able to access it. And on top of that, I'd say with editors, yourself, when you're an editor, you want to be confident that you should be able to answer questions about any story in your publication or online, whatever your media outlet is. So they have to feel almost comfortable with the topic as well, with the content. So I think it's really about opening communication channels, figuring out what kind of content they're interested in, what kind of content you provide, and is there a bridge that can be closed on that? So that's would be one of the suggestions.
Thank you very much. I think that we must thank Claire for her results and the research and the speech. And now we are going to the closing remarks, and it's Klaus who is who've been keeping the computer all the afternoon, thanks to Klaus, to closing remarks. Thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you very much, Jan. And, I'm sorry that we are going a little bit over time, but I tried to be brief, and you maybe have seen a joke of the perfect European, and one of the things is be a talkative like a Finn. So that means that we are probably not the most talkative, but I'm going to conclude this, in a few remarks. I was thinking about the song from 1964 by Bob Dylan, Times They Are Changing. And I think that's something which is a timeless song, and it suits very well to our current times. Agriculture as a profession is changing a lot. We know that there's coming a lot of machinery, it's changing, the ownership is changing, and the ways of doing things are getting different. There's a lot of impact on agricultural journalism. Also, the journalism is on a change, and it has an impact on how the topics are covered in agricultural media, but also on mainstream media, as we heard from Claire, that there's a lot of shift. In the beginning, there was a discussion about press freedoms, and it's really something that we can all see, that press freedoms are now challenged in many countries. It's getting more and more difficult for journalists to accredit and write about topics, and they've been regulated and try to somehow manage. In European level, there is a new legislation, European Media Freedom Act, but as we heard, that there are some problems on how to implement that in many countries. So there's a lot of work to do, but good things are happening. Also, we learned that tech platforms are challenging journalism. Probably that's maybe the biggest shift in our work. I remember when I went to work as a communicator, I also wrote articles at that time. I remember that it was always very easy to get a contact of a person. Whenever you had a phone, you just picked the phone and then you called and you got an answer. Now we learn that it's getting more and more difficult to do that. Journalists are being regulated in a way that you only get a written answer, or somebody who is in charge is coming there to get an answer. So that's clearly a difficulty. And maybe one of the reasons is the social media or these platforms, because once you have them, people have become very, very more careful, because distribution of information through these channels and also online channels is very easy. We learned from Katharina Zeuser that agricultural journalists are important in reporting about innovation. I think for farmers it's a very important source of information that they get from agricultural journalists regarding new technologies and new developments and also agricultural policies. But also agricultural journalism has become more important in informing to consumers, as there are maybe less and less the mainstream media reporting on the topic. The panels discussed about the role of agricultural journalism in the Brussels bubble. And for me, there was a lot of new information, and we noticed that there has been a change, in fact, of obtaining information and getting, we're dealing with more and more complex issues. You have a lot of international treaties, you have many policy areas which are being regulated, and the impact comes to the agriculture, and you have to deal with more complex issues, but to get the information and be able to report on that, that's very, very important, also in the future. We learned that leaks play a role in Brussels. That's something which happens here, but many of the panelists concluded that you have to have a value in the reporting of them, and also that you should challenge them, like you have to get into the fake news when you see them. You should study them thoroughly. So, as I told, that access to people is getting more complicated, and that's a topic I think we all agreed upon, that's a pity, and I don't know whether we concluded some issues regarding that, but definitely is an issue to be discussed more. But to sum up the discussion, I like the comment on Julie Majeshak, what she said, that without informing citizens, there is no democracy, and that's an issue where journalism is definitely a key element and is needed, and it also has direct link to agriculture journalism. I hope when we started to organize this event, we thought that now it's a good time to bring a topic of agricultural journalism and also communications to a symposium, and I hope that you have got new insight, new ideas, and good discussions on the topic. I'm certain that they will continue in some other platforms, and hope that there will be some developments on the field. But I'd like to end this symposium by thanking, of course, all of your speakers. Not all of them are here, but very good presentations, and also the panelists. I'd like to thank the European Committee of Region of enabling this possibility to come here to these premises, and also like to thank Eurocommerce for the lunch servings. Thank you for the audience for listening, and also people online. And this live stream will be available later on as a recording. You'll be able to listen it again, distribute it, and hopefully also those who were not able to join today will get new insights about how the things work in Brussels. And maybe when they get a press release, when they hear something about what's happening here in Brussels, they're more aware of things which are happening at the background. I like the idea that people should be brought more to the farms. I also noticed that it's getting more and more difficult, but it's very important that we are understanding what's happening in the farms, both on the political level, but also the citizens. And ENAJ has been active from its start, organizing press trips to European journalists. And I think that's something which will definitely continue, and we will do our share of that. People would have the knowledge of, the journalists have the knowledge and the possibility to go to the farms to learn new issues from different countries, and also the consumers hopefully are able to read some of the articles. But yeah, I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to wish you success with your important work of informing the citizens and also communicating agriculture. And good luck for the future, and see you next time, perhaps in one of our farm tours. Thank you.
It was not, we didn't think that I will take the floor again, but the next press trip is in Finland. So at the beginning of June, 25 journalists will be there.